It was a quiet Tuesday morning in the small town of Larkspur, where most people knew each other's names and trusted the sound of silence more than sirens, until the silence shattered with flashing lights and raised voices at the edge of Miller's diner. Jack Callahan, a man in his late 30s with a hardened jawline and eyes that had seen more than most, sat alone in a corner booth, sipping black coffee with a chipped mug held in hands that trembled just slightly, not from fear, but from the residual adrenaline of a lifetime spent in war zones rather than breakfast nooks. Jack had returned from a 14-year career as a Navy sniper, with deployments that had taken him from the mountains of Afghanistan to the sands of Iraq, and while he wore no medals on his chest and carried no flag, he bore the invisible scars of service, the weight of names etched in his memory and the silent guilt of survival. Clad in faded jeans, a weathered leather jacket and boots caked with dried mud from the hills beyond town, Jack drew little attention most days, until this one, when a local store alarm mistakenly triggered by a teenage prank set off a cascade of errors. A jittery store owner, unfamiliar with Jack but unnerved by his stoic presence outside, whispered words that ignited fear. "He's armed. He's dangerous." Within minutes, 2 squad cars screeched to a halt, and officers swarmed the diner with tension tight in the air like a drawn bowstring. Jack stood calmly when ordered, offered no resistance, but when they demanded ID, his wallet had fallen behind the booth. The situation escalated, fast. He was handcuffed on the sidewalk, face pressed against the hood of a cruiser, as passers-by watched in confusion and judgment. Humiliation burned deeper than the metal on his wrists. No one knew who he was, no one asked. They saw a rugged man, silent and still, and assumed danger, not discipline. That was when a black SUV pulled up, tires crunching the gravel like an exclamation. Out stepped a tall, gray-haired man in full uniform, a 4-star general, his posture sharp as a salute, his face carved with lines of command. His eyes locked on Jack, then on the officers. "Uncuff him, now!" The street hushed. One officer hesitated, but the general's voice cut sharper than any command they'd ever heard. "You just handcuffed a war hero. This man saved my son's life in Mosul. He's the reason dozens of my men came home." Shock rippled through the crowd, and the young officer's hands fumbled at the cuffs, as if trying to rewind the shame. Jack didn't speak. He didn't need to. The general stepped forward, saluted him, and said the words no one else had. "I'm sorry." It wasn't just an apology. It was acknowledgement, validation, a moment that began in humiliation, transformed into an unexpected honor, a rare reckoning where the silence of a soldier was finally broken by the truth of what he'd endured and what the world had overlooked. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon and painted the sky in dusky hues of crimson and violet, Mason Cole sat alone in his small, sparsely furnished apartment, the echo of the last 24 hours replaying in his mind like a broken record. The humiliation, the disbelief, the quiet rage, all of it swirled around inside him, burning behind his tired eyes. He hadn't spoken to anyone since the general walked in, apologized, and ordered the officers to remove the cuffs from his bruised wrists. The silence in the aftermath was deafening, but it was nothing compared to the war that raged inside his soul. Mason stared at the photographs lined up across the mantel, snapshots of his brothers in arms, those who had made it back and those who hadn't. The guilt of survival weighed heavily on his shoulders, a burden no one could see but he carried. Every day, the news of his wrongful arrest had begun to trickle out. A neighbor who recognized him from the military support group had shared the incident on social media, and within hours, the local community began to stir. Veterans forums lit up. Former teammates began reaching out. But Mason didn't want attention. He didn't want sympathy. What he wanted, what he needed, was dignity, the restoration of a name earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. That night, his phone vibrated. It was from Lieutenant Commander Sarah Vance, a Navy psychologist who had once helped him through a particularly dark episode after his last deployment. "Heard what happened. I'm here," the message read. He stared at it for a long time, before replying with a single word, "Thanks." The next morning, Mason was summoned to meet with General Whitaker at the base. Dressed in a plain black shirt and jeans, he arrived with the same calm posture he had in the field, masking the emotional storm within. Whitaker greeted him with more than just military formality this time. He extended his hand, held Mason's shoulder firmly and said, "We failed you, I failed you." The room fell silent. What followed was not just an apology, but an invitation to speak at a Pentagon-led initiative addressing veteran reintegration and law enforcement sensitivity training. Mason hesitated. He had never sought a spotlight. His identity had always been forged in shadow, a sniper who worked best when unseen, unheard, unknown. But now, ironically, silence was the enemy. If he remained quiet, what happened to him could happen again, to another soldier, another forgotten warrior walking among civilians who had no idea what it meant to carry death in their veins, just to protect peace. After hours of thought, he agreed, but only on one condition. He wanted to visit the officers who arrested him, not to confront, but to understand. With Whitaker's support, Mason met the two patrolmen. Both were young, visibly nervous. One, Officer Daniels, couldn't meet his eyes. The other, Officer Reyes, apologized directly, visibly shaken when Mason told him about the missions he had been on, the people he had lost, the brotherhood that stitched itself into your soul in the battlefield and never quite let go. "You didn't see a threat," Mason said. "You saw a profile, a man alone, beard, vague answers. You followed the book, but sometimes the book's wrong." The meeting was heavy, honest, and when it ended, Officer Daniels, the one who had tightened the cuffs until Mason's wrists were numb, asked if Mason would be willing to speak at the academy. Mason agreed. That night, something inside him shifted. The weight hadn't lifted, not fully, but it had changed shape, from shame to purpose, from anger to advocacy. He wasn't just a sniper anymore. He was a voice. He began writing, drafting his speech, not about war, but about peace, the fragile peace that veterans seek when they return to a world that doesn't know how to welcome them home. He wrote about trauma, about the invisible wounds, about the masks that soldiers wear in everyday life. The speech went viral when he finally delivered it, weeks later, standing in full uniform at the National Law Enforcement Memorial. Cameras captured every word, but it was the moment he stepped down and hugged a young rookie officer who had tears in his eyes that became a symbol. Mason's story wasn't just about injustice anymore. It was about redemption, reconnection, and healing. But even as the applause echoed in his ears that day, Mason knew his journey was far from over. The pain, the flashbacks, the memories, they didn't fade with fame or recognition. They remained. But now they had purpose. Now they were part of something greater, something that might just save another warrior walking home through a world that didn't recognize him. Mason Cole, the forgotten sniper, was forgotten no more, and the fire in his heart, the one that once fueled his trigger finger, now lit the path forward, for him and for those like him. It was only the beginning. As the dust settled from the chaos of the handcuffing incident and the unexpected arrival of the four-star general, the quiet hum of tension still lingered like smoke in the air, refusing to fully dissipate, and Jace Keller, the Navy sniper who had just gone from suspect to national mystery, found himself spiraling into the complex emotions that followed public humiliation and unexpected validation. He sat on the edge of a sterile bench in the quiet back room of the precinct, his wrist still red and raw from the tight steel cuffs that had once reduced him to nothing more than a suspicious man with a duffel bag, and his thoughts were a swirl of rage, shame, disbelief, and a strange aching hope. The general's apology, raw, unfiltered, and surprisingly emotional, had unlocked something deep inside him, not just because of its sincerity, but because it reminded him of a time when his service actually meant something, when he wasn't just another forgotten vet with a 1,000-yard stare and an invisible war raging behind his eyes. And as he stared at the cracked tile floor, flashes of Afghanistan burned behind his vision. The long days on rocky ridges, the ghost-like quiet as he breathed through the scope of his rifle, his heartbeat syncing with the pulse of war, the lives he saved, the men he lost, and the promises he made to himself, all colliding with the brutal truth that the country he bled for now looked at him with suspicion before gratitude. But the story didn't end at the apology. It began again there because, as word of the incident leaked to the media, turning Jace into a reluctant headline, the public's reaction cracked wide open the conversations America had long buried under parades and patriotism, about how veterans were treated, about racial profiling, about justice and what it truly means to serve and protect. And suddenly Jace found himself in the center of a national debate he never asked to join, invited to interviews, questioned by reporters, visited by old comrades who whispered, "They still don't see us." And through it all he struggled with a storm inside, asking himself if he had the strength to become a voice for those who couldn't speak, for the men who didn't come home, for those living under bridges, for those still in battle, unseen, unheard. And as the days passed, he met with the general again. Not in uniform this time, but in plain clothes. Just two men haunted by the same war, but fighting very different ones now. And in a quiet moment over coffee in a diner booth, the general leaned in and said, "They saw your scars, but they didn't know your story. Now you have a chance to tell it." And something about that, the invitation, the burden, the opportunity, struck Jace like a round to the chest, because for the first time in years he wasn't hiding behind the sniper's veil or running from the flashbacks. He was being asked to lead again, to be the point man in a different kind of battle, one for dignity, truth, and redemption. And as he left the precinct with the sunset burning gold on the horizon and the quiet applause of onlookers, who now saw him not as a threat, but as a symbol, he knew his war wasn't over. It had just changed terrain. And this time, he'd fight not with a rifle but with the force of his story, the depth of his pain, and the truth that no one, not even a forgotten warrior, should ever be judged by silence or scars alone. The days following the shocking incident inside the precinct blurred into a haze of official apologies, public outcry, and sudden interest from media outlets who scrambled to piece together the story of the decorated yet unassuming Navy sniper, who had been humiliated by those sworn to protect the very freedoms he had nearly died for. As Chief Commander Ethan Cole stood in the silence of his modest apartment overlooking the Potomac River, the world outside raged with headlines, debates, and online fury. But within the four walls of his solitude, Ethan was grappling with a more complex and private war, one that had less to do with public validation and more to do with the weight of memory, honor, and the painful reality that even heroes could be reduced to assumptions in the wrong zip code, wearing the wrong clothes. The apology from the four-star general, though heartfelt and backed by swift accountability, had not erased the sting of the cold metal cuffs or the judgment in those officers' eyes when they decided he was a threat before he was ever seen, as a man. But what Ethan hadn't expected was the ripple effect that apology caused. Veterans from around the country began reaching out, not just to support him, but to tell their own stories of invisibility and being misunderstood. Emails poured in from former Marines, Army Rangers, Air Force pararescue men, and countless Navy SEALs, many saying they had once walked similar paths through discrimination, misidentification, or the crushing silence of being praised in uniform and disregarded in civilian life. And amidst this storm came a letter from a young ROTC cadet at West Point, who wrote with trembling admiration how Ethan's grace under humiliation had inspired him to serve not just with courage, but with compassion. It was this unexpected legacy, his pain becoming someone else's strength, that slowly pulled Ethan back into the world. He agreed, reluctantly at first, to appear in a veterans' roundtable organized by the Pentagon, where other military leaders spoke openly about systemic bias and how the military community could lead reform by example. And while Ethan was no politician, his words, quiet, raw but rooted in truth, struck a chord that even seasoned generals had to sit with. Meanwhile, the police department that had wronged him suspended both officers involved and invited Ethan to help craft a joint training program to prevent implicit bias against veterans and minorities. It was an offer he initially declined, saying he wasn't sure if he could ever fully trust that system again. But as he walked the long corridor of the training academy one afternoon and saw a young black recruit adjusting his uniform nervously, before entering the classroom, Ethan remembered his own first day of SEAL qualification, the fear, the pride, and the desperate hope to be more than just a stereotype. And it was then he realized he could either walk away from the broken system or step into it and help repair it from within, not for himself, but for every young recruit who shouldn't have to prove his worth by surviving injustice. With a deep breath and a quiet nod, Ethan agreed to lead a series of training seminars, not as a formality, not for PR, but with full conviction, sharing his story with raw honesty to shake the complacency out of those who wore badges and those who issued them. And over time, the man who had been wrongly shackled became the cornerstone of a program that turned hundreds of officers into better versions of themselves. A few months later, during a military gala in D.C., General Richardson pulled Ethan aside and asked him if he'd consider coming back, not into combat but into mentorship, to guide a new generation of Navy recruits through the emotional, psychological and moral gauntlets of service in a divided world. And as Ethan stood there surrounded by the echoes of music and medals, he realized he wasn't just healing, he was transforming, not in uniform, not on rooftops with sniper rifles, but in conversations, in education, in rebuilding faith where it had once been shattered, and so began a new mission, one without gunfire but with purpose burning just as fiercely, as Ethan vowed quietly to himself that if the world wanted to underestimate him again, they'd have to reckon with the thousands of lives he'd already lifted behind him. The following morning, the air at the base was tense, not from the weather, but from the whispered rumors that had spread like wildfire overnight about the Navy sniper who'd been wrongfully detained and the four-star general's unexpected intervention. As Ryan stepped outside his assigned quarters, still wearing the temporary clothes issued by the base staff, he could feel the subtle shift in how people looked at him, some with awe, some with guilt, and others with the uneasy curiosity that comes when someone's quiet pain is suddenly dragged into the light. Inside him, however, the storm had not yet passed. The apology from General Mathers was powerful, even unprecedented, but it could not instantly mend the invisible wounds stitched into his soul over years of sacrifice, betrayal, and the burdens of secrecy. As he walked across the base, the sound of boots hitting the pavement and orders being barked out were familiar, yet they no longer brought him comfort. They reminded him of the days when he was operational, a man whose hands had held steady, under fire, whose eyes had stared down enemies through the scope of a rifle with unwavering certainty, whose silence had protected secrets that others slept peacefully never knowing. General Mathers requested Ryan to attend a classified debriefing, this time not as a suspect or detainee, but as a respected operative whose truth needed to be documented and honored. The room was dim, surrounded by walls lined with soundproofing panels and a few other decorated high-ranking officers, including an Air Force colonel, a Marine intelligence officer, and a civilian from the Pentagon. Mathers began the debrief, not with a statement but a moment of silence, for the years Ryan lost, for the trust he gave that was violated, and for the missions buried beneath redacted reports and silent acknowledgements. Ryan, with his voice low but firm, unfolded his story. The missions he undertook behind enemy lines, the rogue operation in Eastern Europe that had gone sideways, not because of a tactical failure, but due to political betrayal from someone high up, the death of his teammate which haunted his sleep, the orders he followed that later became stains on his conscience. Each word he spoke brought weight to the room, each revelation peeling back the layers of a man who had borne more than any human should. There was no theatrics in his tone, just raw, unfiltered truth. When he finished, the room was silent, not out of disbelief, but out of respect. Mathers then laid out a path forward, full reinstatement if Ryan wanted it, a formal clearing of his record, a public commendation for his service, and most of all, a new assignment that wouldn't send him back into shadows, but would instead place him in a position to train and mentor future operatives, shaping them not just as weapons of war, but as moral, resilient defenders of their country. Ryan didn't answer right away. That night he walked alone on the tarmac under the open sky. He thought about the simplicity of civilian life, the freedom in anonymity, the beauty in peace, the joy in relationships untouched by the weight of war. But he also felt the call, the unshakable sense that his story wasn't finished, that perhaps his greatest contribution wasn't the missions completed in silence, but the legacy he could leave by telling the truth, teaching with integrity, and ensuring no one else would suffer the same betrayal. As the wind brushed past his face and the moon cast its solemn light on the base below, Ryan made his decision, not just for himself, but for the brotherhood he still carried in his heart, and the truth that at long last was no longer buried. The morning after his decision, Ryan stood at the threshold of a new chapter in his life, not one defined by camouflage or covert orders, but by purpose, redemption, and the healing only time and truth could bring. He returned to the base headquarters, in full uniform, the Navy SEAL trident still gleaming on his chest. A symbol no longer just of silent sacrifice, but now of recognition and honor, hard-won after years of being unseen. His reinstatement ceremony was quiet, private, held in a conference room with just a few key officials present. General Mathers, the base commander, and a select few who had read his debrief file and understood the gravity of what he had endured. There were no public speeches or media flashbulbs. Ryan had never wanted fame, only justice. As the final commendation was placed in his file, a classified one bearing the seal of the Department of Defense and the words, "For actions in defense of national integrity," Ryan saluted the general with calm eyes, not for show, but as an exchange of mutual respect that now felt genuine, not forced. But the real work began after the papers were signed. Ryan chose to accept the offer to train future special operations candidates, not just in marksmanship or endurance, but in ethics, decision-making under moral pressure, and what it truly meant to carry the responsibility of life and death in your hands. He rewrote the curriculum, not just from doctrine but from lived experience. He introduced courses on the psychology of isolation, the toll of sustained deception, and how to spot the warning signs of political manipulation from within. Some called it radical, others called it revolutionary. But to Ryan, it was simply necessary. The young men and women who stepped into his classroom weren't met with a hard-charging drill sergeant, but a man who looked into their eyes and asked them why they were here, who they were willing to become in the name of duty. His words carried a weight no textbook ever could. Slowly his reputation spread, not just as a legendary sniper, but as a warrior philosopher, someone who turned pain into purpose. But Ryan's transformation wasn't only professional. He began to reconnect with the life he left behind. He reached out to his estranged father, once a stern military man himself, now softened by age and regret. Over coffee and long silences, they rebuilt what war had broken. He visited the gravesite of his fallen teammate from the Eastern European mission, whispering the apology he had carried in his chest for years, and promising to tell his story honestly in the lectures he gave. He volunteered at local veteran centers, listening more than he spoke, knowing that sometimes the deepest healing begins with being heard. And slowly, the community that once misunderstood him began to embrace him. One afternoon, after a particularly emotional class session where a young recruit had broken down describing his fear of losing himself in the job, Ryan walked alone to the edge of the training field where the American flag flapped high in the wind. For the first time in years, he let himself cry. Not for what he had lost, but for the man he had finally become. A man who was no longer just a weapon in the dark, but a light for others trying to find their way out of it. When news outlets finally caught wind of the story, a Navy sniper wrongly detained, a general's apology and a warrior's quiet redemption, Ryan was offered interviews, book deals, even film rights. He turned most of them down. What mattered more to him now was not spectacle but service. He did accept one interview, though, with a non-profit military podcast, where he told the entire story in his own words, unflinching and unsensational. It went viral, not for its drama but for its raw humanity. Thousands of veterans reached out. Some said it gave them hope, some said it made them cry for the first time in years. And a few quietly thanked him for saying out loud what they had always carried in silence. As months passed, Ryan began to smile more. He adopted a rescue dog, a German shepherd named Recon, and they took long hikes together in the mountains, outside the base. He started dating again, cautiously at first, eventually falling in love with a woman named Elena, a trauma nurse who understood the weight behind quiet eyes. They bonded not over war stories, but over the belief that healing, though slow, was real. 1 year after the day he was wrongfully handcuffed, the base held a silent ceremony. Not for Ryan, but for all operatives past and present who had suffered in silence. Ryan was asked to speak. He stood before the crowd, in full-dress blues, and said only this: "We are not what others did to us. We are what we choose to do with the truth." The crowd rose in silent salute, and as the sun set behind him, casting golden light over the faces of the next generation of warriors, Ryan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not vengeance, not anger, not even pride, but peace. True, quiet, earned peace.